safety compliance can be very difficult. And true safety compliance goes beyond just showing some safety videos once a year and having a box of safety glasses in the break room. True safety compliance requires planning and strategically assessing the hazards in your workplace. And there are a lot of ins and outs that people may not be familiar with. There are details in the OSHA regulations that are easily overlooked. Many medium to small size companies don't have a full-time safety professional or a safety professional with a degree. Organizations typically that have 100 or fewer employees often pass their safety responsibilities to an HR manager or a maintenance manager or somebody else who has to juggle multiple responsibilities. And so in these situations, it's really easy to overlook some of these minute details that are buried in the OSHA regulations. So without the help of a full-time safety professional, it may be almost impossible to understand and implement all of these requirements. So today we're going to review some of the requirements, and hopefully you'll have a little bit better understanding of not only how complex safety compliance can be, but some of the little things you can do to boost your programs to make them even more effective. So the idea for this particular class came to me after a visit at one of these sites. We walked around a couple hours looking at all the different aspects of the safety program that my host thought they were doing well. And many of them were right on the money. They were doing a great job. They were very knowledgeable and very engaged with the day-to-day safety process. But when I asked follow-up questions like, where's your OSHA 300A posted? Or can you show me your PPE assessment? I got like panicked blank stares, like they had no idea what I was talking about. And I said, well, these are some of the things you may not be aware of. And so I started to explain some of the intricacies of OSHA compliance. And they looked at me and they said, do I really have to do all that? And I thought, there it is, right? It made me realize that even though this particular facility had a good safety program on the surface, there's so many more compliance issues way underneath the surface that are just simply unknown to most people. So that's what we're going to cover today. And again, as Rick kindly mentioned, my website is certifiedsafety.org. You can find more information there, not only about this topic, but about safety training programs and compliance issues and other questions you may have about safety. So I know not all of you are in manufacturing, a good chunk of you are, but I think a lot of this applies to many of you across the board. So I tried to take as broad of a scope as I could when looking at some of these issues, and this is not by any means a comprehensive list. This is just a taste of some of the things that go on behind the scenes that you may not be aware of. So we'll start off by talking about access to medical records, record keeping and posting, compliance and written programs that OSHA requires you to document how you conduct your program and how it operates. Fire extinguisher inspections, hazardous materials and safety data sheets, personal protective equipment, employee observations and certifications, and finally we'll wrap up with hearing conservation. So our first topic is access to medical records. And I'm going to be using OSHA nomenclature that I hope most of you understand when I say 29 CFR 1910.1020. That's just simply the place in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, where you will find these particular OSHA regulations. So hopefully most of you know what that means when I say 29 CFR such and such. If you don't, you can actually take that. It's almost like an internet URL. If you type 29 CFR 1910.1020 into a browser, you will get access to medical records. So this is a helpful milepost for you. All right, so under this particular OSHA regulation, employees are required to have access to records relating to medical and industrial hygiene monitoring. So what does that really mean? If an employee generates certain paperwork in the course of their employment, such as accident forms, medical surveillance documentation, or if your company monitors the workplace for things such as noise, or you testing for dust or certain chemicals in the atmosphere, employees have a right to obtain copies of those documents. The OSHA standard requires notifying employees of these rights and, quote, upon first entry into employment. So if we have some HR people in the room, I'm going to guess you probably know first entry into employment is a coded way of saying either day one or before, right? You might hand them and maybe sometimes you might email a packet of documents. That might be a place to do it. Or again, on day one orientation. And not only that, do you have to notify them upon first entry, but you have to notify all your employees and remind them of this right annually. In order to comply, to quote the OSHA regulation, the employer shall inform employees of the existence, location, and availability of these records, the person responsible for maintaining the record, and each employee's right to access the record. That's really all that they have to know. So this doesn't have to be a half-hour training. As a matter of fact, back in the day when we used to hand out hard paychecks, I think everyone probably has direct deposit now, but back in the day, when you would hand out a hard paycheck, we would just staple this notice to a paycheck. It really doesn't require much more notification than that, but it does have to be done annually. Again, to cover the types of documents that they need to be aware of, any health insurance forms, first aid or accident records, industrial hygiene monitoring, like for noise, dust, chemicals, and of course, safety data sheets. The standard simply says that the employer has up to 15 days to provide the documentation upon request. All right. And if it can't be provided within 15 days, the employer at least has to explain to the employee why there's a delay and how much longer that they anticipate the request to take. I recognize in larger organizations, some of these documents may not be kept at the same work site where the employees are. So, if you have to request something from a corporate office or from a different location, it may take a couple days to get those documents. So it's important to let your employees know that. All right, the next topic is OSHA record keeping. I'm not going to go very deep into this. EANE does a great job, and I know they hold a lot of sessions about record keeping in particular. I know that's something that they've done frequently. But it does surprise me when I go out to visit facilities, and again, typically smaller facilities. Some of them have no idea that they have to maintain records of their accidents. I mean, it really kind of shocks me. And it's not just enough to have an accident form in a drawer. Oh yeah, here's the form the employee filled out. You actually have to maintain a specific, what they call a log or a document of these accidents. If you're not familiar with them, they are available for download from the OSHA website, osha.gov. And if you just type in record keeping in the search bar, you'll get these documents. So again, most employees do a fine job, but a lot of folks are not familiar with all of the intricacies of record keeping. Now, employers with 10 or fewer employees do not need to complete the forms. All right. So however, if there are more than 10 employees at any time during the calendar year, the employer has to complete the record keeping forms. So that includes full-time, part-time, temporary, and seasonal workers. Okay. This exemption for small employers is based on an entire company rather than a single establishment, as they call it. For example, if a company has 2 establishments, let's say maybe you're a restaurant chain and you have 2 very small restaurants, one that has 5 employees and one with 7. I don't know if I'd want to go to a restaurant with only 5 employees, but we'll just use that as an example. The company has clearly, as a whole, has more than 10 employees, even though there are 2 separate establishments. Now, in that particular instance, each establishment needs to keep their own records, but the overall company is required because there are more than 10 employees. I hope that's clear. There's also exemptions for establishments in certain industries. For example, well, I just used restaurants. Restaurants are exempt from record keeping. So I guess that was a bad example. Banks, medical offices, those are some examples of places that do not need to keep these records. There is a complete list found at 29 CFR 1904. Again, if you just simply type that into your Google search bar or whatever browser you're using, 29 CFR 1904, you'll get not only the list, but the full regulation itself. So the main record keeping document is known as OSHA Form 301. And you may know this as simply as the accident report. Your company may have your own accident report that either you developed or maybe your insurance company gave you. It is not a requirement to use OSHA's form. However, it is important to know that any form that you use must mirror the information that's on the 301. Okay. So within 7 days after you've been notified by your employee that an accident occurred, you must fill out an accident form. So you have up to 7 days. That gives you time to make a determination if it's an actual work-related injury. Sometimes these injuries or situations may not be directly work-related. And so you have a little leeway before you are required to actually fill out the form. And again, to be considered an equivalent form under OSHA, any substitute must contain all of the information that's found on the 301. Now, OSHA requires you to maintain this form or your equivalent form for 5 years following the year to which the form pertains. So, instance, if we had an accident this year in 2024, you must keep the form for 5 following years, 2025, 26, 27, 28, and you may dispose of this form at the end of 2029. Okay, so it's the current year plus 5. And that applies to all 3 of these record keeping documents that I'm going to talk about. So the central document in all of this is known as the OSHA 300 log of work-related injuries and illnesses. This is where the accidents are tracked as a group. So in addition to simply tracking accidents, this document also contains information such as the number of lost work days, the number of restricted days, and unfortunately, number of fatalities as well. So again, within 7 calendar days after you receive information about a case, you have that time to decide if it's going to be recordable under the OSHA record keeping requirements. And then after that 7 days, you have to either determine, is it work related? And if so, it goes onto the log. It's really important, I can't stress this enough, to make sure you maintain this document accurately, because you can be subject to OSHA fines if you don't maintain it properly. All right, so what that means is if you have an employee who is out of work for any length of time, or an employee who may be back at work but on restricted duty, you have to track the number of days up to 180 that those employees are under those restrictions or loss of work. Now, if you download the forms from OSHA, they have a fillable, writable PDF form. So once you fill in the accident name and date, it will automatically track those for you, right? So that's a real nice advantage of using their form. But if you're doing it manually, I would suggest updating it at least monthly. I recommend weekly because you can lose track of these days very quickly. So it should be part of your regular document maintenance to check that every week. But again, if you use the automated one, you're all set. And finally, the last of the trio of these documents is the 300A summary of work-related injuries and illnesses. And as the name implies, it's the summary of all the accidents that you've had throughout the year. At the end of your year, this summary is signed by a company executive and posted in your workplace somewhere prominently, like a break room or a public bulletin board, and it must be posted every year between February 1st and April 30th. All right, this is one of the things that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. A lot of people miss this very important requirement. And again, when OSHA comes to visit, they will want to see this document that it's been signed off. So even after you post it, make sure you put it back in your files. Again, if you use the OSHA automated forms, I'm not sure how well you can see it on your screen. We have total number of cases, total number of days away from work. And you'll notice underneath there are letters, G, H, I. If we look at total number of days away from work, K, L, those actually correspond directly to the columns on the 300 form. If you look right in the middle, we have days away from work, job transfer, HIJ, days away from work, KL, and so forth. Those automatically pre-populate onto your 300A form if you use the automated form. So there's another advantage for doing that. All right. But if you're doing it manually, it's very simple. It gives you the letters of where you find the information on your 300 log. You'll notice on the right-hand side, you have your establishment information, average number of employees, the hours worked, and then importantly, must be signed off by a company executive, someone who takes responsibility for saying that this information is true and correct. And remember, you must maintain these documents for 5 years. All right, our next subject is OSHA written programs. It's not enough to just simply have a safety program. You may need to document how certain safety programs are structured, who has the responsibility for the program, and how it's carried out. Now, not every single OSHA standard requires a written plan, but many of them do. For instance, hazard communication, lockout tagout, confined space entry, emergency action plans, and fire prevention plans are just a few of the ones that OSHA requires to ask you to have a written program in place. OSHA does this when they consider a safety or health situation or topic to be serious. So again, they usually require a written documentation of the steps that you take to counteract these hazards. Here's a list of some of the most serious hazards faced by workers and the ones that OSHA does require a written program for. So you'll notice things like, again, hazard communication, that's chemical safety, personal protective equipment, your emergency action plans, what happens if there's a fire or inclement weather, bomb threats, all of those things might be part of your emergency action plan. Some of you may or may not have confined spaces, or you may not fall under the process safety management criteria. So again, it's going to be up to you to determine which one of these that you need. So as an employer, you, again, going back to what I said earlier, you have to assess the hazards of your workplace to determine which ones of these apply to you. One of the things that I always encourage my clients to do, when you have a written program, put some sort of a header on the document. Don't just write hazard communication. It's nice to see the date that the program was issued and any revision dates and a place for people to mark that it's been approved by, again, somebody in the company, whether it's your safety manager, your plant manager, or somebody else in authority. So it's nice to see that right up front. As an inspector, when I open a program and look at that, I can see, okay, so this program's about 5 years old. And look, they updated it this past April. That's great. You're looking at your documentation. Add a section at the very end of your document called revision history. Again, this is going to cue in an OSHA inspector or someone else to say, look, here are the changes that we've made over the years, right? It's important to document those changes. It demonstrates that you're taking the time to review your information and assessing your hazards on a regular basis. Okay. These documents don't have to be carved in stone. They're living, breathing documents, and it's okay to update them and change them every year, right? It's okay to make changes. Another really quick tip, oftentimes people will say, Dan Williams is in charge of this program. Typically, I like people to use positions. The safety manager is in charge of this program, or the HR manager is in charge of this program. That way, if people change, you don't have to go in and change the document, right? So it's better by position rather than specific name. All right, surprisingly, fire extinguisher inspections are something that I see lacking in many companies. And it really surprises me that many organizations don't know that they have to inspect these fire extinguishers. Almost every company has fire extinguishers. Everywhere you go in public and in business, everyone's got fire extinguishers. If you have them, OSHA requires that these extinguishers are inspected monthly per 29 CFR 1910.157. Now, annually, your extinguishers are sent off to your vendor who supplies your extinguishers. They recharge them and they do pressure testing to ensure that the cylinder passes pressure testing. However, while that extinguisher is hanging on your wall, OSHA requires them to be inspected monthly. So most employers do this inspection themselves. It really takes virtually no time. I would say probably even less than 10 seconds to inspect an extinguisher. We'll walk through what that means here in just a second. But do know that it does have to be done, whether you do it or you contract out. I was at a client site yesterday, and they hired Cintas to do their first aid cabinets and to supply their extinguishers. And Cintas comes in once a month to do their inspections for them. So hooray for them. Other companies choose to do it themselves. So if you've ever noticed the little paper tag hanging on your extinguisher, as I mentioned, the vendor will punch it or stamp it with the month and the year of the last vendor inspection. That's the last pressure testing and recharge. If you flip that tag over, you'll notice there's a grid on the back, like the one we see in the picture here. This is where your monthly visual inspection must be documented. Okay. The inspector simply needs to put their initials and the date in which the inspection took place. And anyone can perform monthly visual inspections. They don't have to be certified or whatever. If you have a basic understanding, you've had fire extinguisher training, and not even hands-on, just simple classroom training is sufficient. Anyone can inspect an extinguisher. So you can designate an employee, a facility manager, a safety officer. Any of these people can do it. They just have to know what to look for. And it's really just 5 or 6 items. Starting from the bottom up, we want to make sure that our paper tag is in place from our vendor, that the nozzle or the cone is in good condition. It's not cracked or damaged. The same with the hose, that it's properly attached. It's not bulging, damaged, or falling off the equipment. The casing itself is not rusted, rotted, bulging, or dirty. And a lot of manufacturing facilities, sometimes these can get covered with manufacturing byproducts, sawdust, dirt, chemicals. So you might want to keep a shroud over it, or some people have them put in a case. You just want to keep your extinguishers clean and ready for use. Finally, at the top, we have our pressure gauge to indicate that it's properly pressurized. And if you can see in the picture here, there's a red, yellow, and green zone, just like traffic lights. The needle should be in the green zone. If it's in yellow or red, that's either lost its pressure or it may have been discharged and someone put it back on the wall. Any discharged extinguisher should be taken out of service and replaced immediately. Finally, on the top, we have the pull pin and seal, usually that little plastic tag you may notice holding the pin in place. You want to make sure those are in place as well. So that's really it. It's just a simple 10-second inspection and then sign off on the back of the tag. Let's take a look at a situation here. Hopefully, if you all can see the picture here, this would tell you there's something wrong. I hope you all see this picture and say, there's something wrong there. And I would bet $100 bill that if I came into any one of your buildings right now, I could find at least one extinguisher like this. Thanks, Vin. Vin, all right, good job, Vin. Vin gave me the yes. This is very, very common. In my 35 years as a safety professional, I don't know that I've ever been into a facility where there wasn't at least one blocked fire extinguisher. Now, this picture is an extreme example. But if we look at other examples like this, these may not be quite so obvious, right? But that push cart on the far left picture, you might think to yourself, well, I can just roll the cart out of the way. That is an OSHA violation. We're blocking the fire extinguisher. They must be free and accessible at all times. The middle picture, there's two big violations going on there as far as I'm concerned. Number one, we're putting materials near the fire extinguisher where it should be free and clear access. We should be able to access that extinguisher without having to step over brooms, shovels, boxes. And there's one other big hazard there that I hope you all see right off the bat. And that is things blocking the emergency exit, right? We're not going to go into that right now. Hopefully you all know that your fire exit should be free and clear at all times as well. So people leaving materials in front of an exit door, very, very common. Now, this picture on the far right, again, you may think to yourself, oh, well, I could reach that extinguisher. I can reach right over the top of that waste bucket. Under the OSHA regulations, that is a violation. We should not have any storage around, above, or beneath an extinguisher. It should be free and clear access. Now, unfortunately, OSHA doesn't say how far. That's a common question I get. Is it 3 feet? Is it 6 feet? How much open space do I have to leave? They don't say. Use your common sense. 3 feet is probably sufficient, okay? But we just want to make sure there's nothing above, below, or around your fire extinguishers. All right, hazard communication. Most of us do a very good job with maintaining safety data sheets and labeling all of our chemicals, but some folks are not aware that one of the requirements of 29 CFR 1910.1200 is that if you have hazardous chemicals on site, you must maintain an inventory of those chemicals in your written hazard communication plan. So not only do you have to have the written plan, but part of that is including an inventory of all hazardous chemicals on site. All right. So this not only includes tracking of the chemicals, but also having the accompanying safety data sheet, or SDS for short, for every hazardous chemical in your workplace. And it's important to make sure that we keep those safety data sheets up to date. A question I often get is, do safety data sheets expire? Yes, they do indeed expire, but the expiration depends on the discovery of new and significant information. OSHA requires you, and again, they're not very clear. They just say that they must be the most recent version. Okay, what does that mean? It's really up to your supplier to determine which is the newest version. Take something like Windex, for instance. Windex has been around forever and ever, and the formulation has never changed. If you have a Windex SDS from 1985, it's probably still good. Now, again, as an inspector, I might look at that and say, well, you might want to think about updating that. You only are required to have the most recent version, but that's still incumbent upon you to make that determination and to know whether or not you actually have the most recent. It's a burden. When I was in safety compliance at Yankee Candle, we had thousands upon thousands of safety data sheets for the fragrances. Many of them were test fragrances that we tried out in our laboratory. Many of them never made it to full production, but we still had to maintain safety data sheets for all of those. And then we had to determine, is this the most recent? If you don't use a chemical for a long time, you can archive your safety data sheets and say, this batch here, well, we got rid of this chemical, so we're going to put them in archive, but you still have to maintain the safety data sheet for 30 years after you stop using the chemical. Okay, so again, that's a really big burden on employers. The reason for that, if you think back about a lot of chemicals over the years that we've discovered were hazardous. Think of something like asbestos or saccharin. At one time, those were miracle chemicals, right? And the safety data sheets that were issued at that time may not have reflected accurate data that we learned later on, right? We learned that those were hazardous chemicals. So years down the road, if somebody made a claim to say, oh, I was injured or I developed an illness from this chemical, you could then retrieve that older data sheet and say, well, we just didn't know that. Certainly now everyone says asbestos is dangerous, but 30 years ago, we didn't know that. So that's why it's important to keep those for so long. As far as your hazardous chemical inventory, there's a couple steps. First, just identify all the chemicals you have on site. You can do it visually through a walkthrough. If you have a safety committee, use your safety committee for that purpose. Take an area of your facility and walk through and document all the chemicals that are in use. Or check with your purchasing department. Check your purchasing records. Hey, what have we bought in the last year? What are the chemicals that we've purchased? That's a real quick and easy way to determine what you have on site. You need to determine the quantity that you have on site and where the chemicals are kept. Assess and document the hazards. Is it a flammable chemical? Should it be in a flammable cabinet? Is it a corrosive? And so forth. And then again, on a regular basis, review and update that inventory. If you've stopped using the chemical, move it into an archive, move the safety data sheets into an archive, and keep your inventory up to date. Very, very important. Now, some of you may have heard OSHA recently incorporated significant new changes to their hazard communication program regarding chemical safety. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go over it today, but I just want to alert most of you that there is a change to the chemical safety aspect of hazard communication. If you need help and you're not aware of the changes, contact a safety professional, go to the OSHA website, give me a call. There's lots of people and resources available who can give you a hand with that. But you want to make sure that you're not caught without having these changes in place. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, assessing workplace hazards is very, very critical to making sure that we eliminate hazards and that we protect our employees. So my question is, do you provide PPE to your employees? Most employers do. And again, as I said earlier, having a box of safety glasses and safety gloves somewhere in a cabinet, that's not considered compliance, right? In the spirit of the OSHA regulations and the PPE standard, which is 29 CFR 1910.132, employers are required to assess the hazards and then match the PPE to those hazards. I had a really interesting situation where I started work at a particular company, and I noticed out on our receiving dock that people were handling wooden pallets with their bare hands, and people would often get cuts and splinters. And so I made this big sign: when handling pallets, wear gloves. I was so proud of myself. I printed this and I went and put it on the wall. And I thought, good for me, right? Check mark. About a week later, an employee came to me with a huge chunk of wood embedded in his hand. Poor kid was maybe a day out of high school, and he had these big doe eyes. He, was afraid he was going to get fired or something for having an accident. And I said, were you wearing gloves? He said, oh yeah, I had gloves on. I said, well, let's go out on the floor and check this out. I said, well, show me your gloves. What happened? And he walks over to a little box, pop-up box of latex gloves. And he looks at me with these big doe eyes, like he's ready to start tearing up. And he says, well, I had gloves on. And I thought, oh man, I'm so stupid, right? I said, wear gloves, but I didn't say which gloves, right? So it's really important for us when we are prescribing PPE that it's the right PPE for the job. If you have employees who handle chemicals, let's say acetone, for instance. Again, let's use that same box of latex gloves. Acetone degrades latex very quickly, so that would not be an appropriate choice for glove material. It's your responsibility to check your safety data sheets for chemical exposure information and proper PPE. That's going to be in section 8 of all of your safety data sheets. So whether it's eye protection, face protection, chemical protection, noise protection, respiratory protection, these PPE assessments must be documented. All right, it's very important. Now, why is this important? When we look at something called the hierarchy of hazard controls, safety management philosophy tells us that the best way to get rid of a hazard is to eliminate it or to substitute a less hazardous activity or substance, engineer the control of the hazard, for instance, like putting up guards on a machine, or administrative controls like changing the way people work. The least effective way that we have to protect people from hazards is through personal protective equipment. That is the bottom of our hierarchy of controls here. And that's why it's the least effective. If we put a guard on a piece of equipment or we enclose a process, we are putting a physical barrier between the employee and the hazard. But if they have to rely on using PPE, as I've demonstrated, that might not be the right PPE, or I don't want to wear that PPE, or those glasses are fog up too much on me, or I hate these gloves. There are a million reasons why people won't comply. And so it makes PPE the least effective, right? So when we're looking at the hazards of our workplace and we're relying on PPE, that's why it's important to consider all the hazards and show or document that we have considered the proper way to protect people. Now, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. This is a simple PPE assessment. You can see we have tasks on the left-hand side, and then what types of PPE are required to do that. Now, again, I might recommend that this is a little more detailed. For instance, it says pouring calcium, cotton gloves. Okay, that's good. Then we see over here melt waste, chemical gloves. Well, we didn't really say what kind of chemical gloves. I would prefer that were a little more detailed. But nevertheless, we've documented that we've taken the time to consider the requirements. That's a simple form. Here's one that's way more complex. And again, OSHA doesn't say which way you have to do it. It's up to you. This one, boy, they've created some sort of a rubric for the level of hazard and how frequently it might happen and how the number of people who are expected to be exposed to that hazard. And then they've come up with some sort of a numbering system. Wow. They really put a lot of thought into this. And that's great. You can do it either way, right? You just need to demonstrate that you've taken the time to consider the hazards. All right. But that is part of your PPE program, and it's very critical that you do take the time to do this. Our next topic is employee observations, and I'm going to focus specifically on powered industrial trucks. There are a few OSHA standards that do require employers to ensure that your employees are fully compliant. And again, one of these is powered industrial trucks. Another one is lockout tagout. But we're going to focus on powered industrial trucks. Employers under 29 CFR 1910.178. Employers must observe employees operating powered industrial trucks for which they've been trained and document those observations. All right. So every 3 years, I think we're going to get into that in a minute. Every 3 years, you must observe the employee. And again, it must be on each specific piece of equipment they've been trained. So for instance, if this operator here gets on a sit-down forklift or a reach lift of some sort, then they have to demonstrate their proficiency on each one of those pieces of equipment. So basically what we're doing, we just have to ensure that the employee is competent to operate a truck safely, as demonstrated by the completion of training and evaluation. So this just simply demonstrates to OSHA that you certify your employees are fully trained and that they understand the requirements. This is just and again, an example of a driver evaluation checklist. There's a million of these things on the internet. You can download them and you can change them to fit your workplace. If there are specific hazards, sounds horn at the corner of the transfer station. I don't know, you can make up your own hazard, but you just want to make sure that you are observing your employees. And again, this should take place every 3 years for the observation. Respirators. This is, boy, this is a tough one. 29 CFR 1910.134. So many times I've gone into plants where the safety person or the person in charge of safety tells me that employees are not required to wear respirators. And then I walk past an operator desk and I see a respirator hanging there. These are probably one of the most common pieces of equipment that employees will purchase for themselves at a store like Lowe's or Home Depot and bring them into work. And this is a whole nother topic for another day. Do not ever allow employees to bring in their own safety equipment unless you've thoroughly checked it and they've been trained to use it. Okay. I can't stress that enough. But when it comes to respiratory protection, you have to make an initial assessment. We talked about hazard assessments and do air monitoring to make sure you've made an estimate of whether or not respiratory protection is required. So if you're generating a lot of dust or there are chemicals in use, you have to do industrial hygiene monitoring to know if you've surpassed a threshold that requires respiratory protection. All right. And there's a whole nother topic of discussion about dust masks and employees who want to use them for what we call personal comfort. I'm only focusing on right now where we have a requirement to wear respirators. All right, this is another one of those programs that OSHA requires you to have a formal written respiratory protection program. All right, so when you have your respiratory protection program, there are some very critical elements that are required. You have to have the procedure for selecting your respirators. Employees must have medical evaluations, which we'll talk about in just a moment. You have to fit test the employees when they return to the workplace. You, as an employer, have to ensure that those respirators fit your employees properly. Document the procedures for when respirators should be used and the process for cleaning, disinfecting, storing, inspecting, and discarding and maintaining respirators. If your employees use supplied air, in other words, there's an air line that connects to the respirator, you have to ensure that the air quality is adequate. So testing procedures for that as well. And of course, document how your employees are trained. Pardon me. So as I mentioned, medical surveillance is what we call pulmonary function exams. Many people who have asthma or COPD may not be physically capable to wear a respirator, and it could put them at risk. So that's why anyone who's required to wear a respirator must have this pulmonary function exam. And the exam will reveal whether or not the person is fit to wear a respirator. As I mentioned, when the employee returns to the workplace, you must conduct annual fit testing to ensure that the right respirator has been selected. Everybody has different facial structures. Some people have more narrow noses, some people have broader noses. And so different respirators will fit people different ways. So you can't just buy a giant box of 3M respirators and hope that they fit all the employees. You might have to have several different brands and several different sizes to accommodate men, women, small heads, big heads, whatever. But it is important that you ensure that those respirators fit properly. And that's documented in your program as well. So about 30 million workers are exposed to hazardous noise on the job, and noise-induced hearing loss is probably the most common occupational hazard for American workers. My own father, after he was in World War II, went to work in a factory where he worked for 37 years. And this was prior to OSHA being enacted in 1970. So from 1945 to 1970, there were no national standards for employee protection. And my father didn't wear hearing protection on the job. As he aged and got older, he started to lose his hearing. You know, first and you may notice this in your own families, right? The TV gets a little bit louder. And, the grandkids say, "Hey, Grandpa, why is the TV so loud?" Rick's laughing, right? Hopefully your TV's not that loud. But that's how we start to notice things. Maybe at the supper table, someone says, "Hey, pass the salt." And like, "Hey, Dad, we're right here. You don't have to yell." But that's what happened to my dad, right? He didn't have hearing protection on the job. And he eventually lost most of his hearing. If you have to raise your voice to speak with someone who's only 3 feet away from you, typically arm's length, you're probably in a high noise area. That's a good rule of thumb, but we have to be 100% certain. So that means, again, industrial hygiene monitoring, noise monitoring, and what we call personal dosimetry, where they clip a little recorder to an employee and follows them around for the day to see that specific employee's level of exposure. So it's, again, going back to what I said earlier at the beginning, you have to assess the noise in your workplace to know exactly what the noise levels are. It's not enough to just put a box of earplugs on the shelf and say, hey, if you want to wear them, if you feel like it's loud, go ahead, put some earplugs in. We really have to have a handle on what that noise level is. Again, client I was visiting recently, they had the box of earplugs out. And I said, well, gee, it doesn't seem very loud in here. And they said, oh, well, when we start up this certain machine, which we don't use very often, it gets really loud in here. And so people want to have earplugs available. And I said, when that machine starts, what's the noise level? And they had no idea. They'd never done an assessment. So they might not have needed it, depending on how long the machine runs for. They may not have tripped a long-term threshold. If they run the machine for 15 minutes once a week, no matter how loud that is, that might not be loud enough to require hearing protection, right? So there's a lot of factors that go into it. It's up to you to have that assessment done and then inform the employee. So put the earplugs there and say, when machine 21 is running, you must wear earplugs because the noise level is over 85 decibels, something to that effect, right? So I would discourage you from randomly placing earplugs in the workplace to let people use if they feel like it. You really need to assess that hazard. One of the problems with some of these types of earplugs, like the orange ones and the yellow ones, these foam ones, you have to pinch them and roll them up between your fingers and insert them into your ear. If you work in a facility where there are chemicals or dirt present, an employee can transfer those chemicals or dirt onto the earplug when they squeeze it and put it in their ear, thereby developing an ear infection, which could lead to an infection or lead to hearing loss. So we want to make sure that if we're providing this PPE, that we really need it, that we're not just putting it out there to make people happy, right? If people say it's too loud, you need to conduct a noise assessment. And then if you do have noise in the workplace, under 29 CFR 1910.95, you are required to have a hearing conservation program, which includes employee training, providing hearing protection devices, and conducting what we call audiograms of your employees. On an annual basis, you have to check your employees to make sure that they're not developing work-related hearing loss. All right, so if you do trip that threshold and you're required to have noise protection, then you have to have a written, see how this is all tying together like a nice little bow, do the assessment, have a written program, and then provide the training and the support for the employees. And this is another one of those documents. Hey, I had my noise, my ears checked. I had an audiogram last year. Can you get me a copy of that document? That goes all the way back to the very first thing we talked about with the medical documents, right? So that's one of those documents that would be available to employees. Okay, that's it for now. There are more. I wish this were an exhaustive list, but as you can see, some of these things you might not have been aware of. OSHA compliance is very difficult. If you need help, Certified Safety is here to help you, as well as many, many other safety professionals. And the OSHA website, again, osha.gov. My number and email are here and available to you after the presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me or whomever, if you have questions or concerns. Definitely will be glad to help you.